Hello, welcome to a video and talk on a common theme for pretty much any strength sport, and it's a talk that I think a lot of people find very useful. This talk is going to be reasonably general in scope. It's not going to provide you with any go-to solutions. I'm not going to lay out a program, lay out drills you can do or anything to overcome a specific injury. I'm just going to talk overall strategies of how you can either prevent overuse injury from being a problem, or how you can cope with whatever overuse injury like tendonitis or a strain that you may currently have, and give you some coping strategies if something drastic happens and you get acute failure from overuse. What we'll do is we'll start the talk by discussing the three main lifting sports, being powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, their injury profiles, common injuries, and the incidency of injury in those sports. And then we're going to go over, firstly, we're going to talk about prevention of overuse injury. Secondly, we're going to talk about the maintenance of overuse injury or treating symptoms or fighting fires. Thirdly, we'll talk about how to program or how to train to prevent overuse injury. And finally, we will discuss what happens when something goes wrong and you do get an acute overuse injury. And before we go into the talk, I'd just like to preface this by saying I'm not a physiotherapist, qualified anyway. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an exercise therapist. I'm a strength coach by trade, although I do deal with rehab in my day-to-day work. And have been doing so for a few years. So I have some insights into the process, although I'm not a qualified professional. So any advice you get away from this video, you take it under your own discretion, and you can't use it as a medical advice, because it's not. Okay, so the title of the talk is Dealing with Overuse Injuries as a Lifter, Coping and Curing the Most Common Injury Issue in Strength Sports. Okay, let us begin. So firstly, I want to talk about powerlifting. This was from a study published in 2011 where they looked at the incidences of injury in powerlifters. They had a sample size of 245 competitive and elite powerlifters, and it was collected by questionnaire. So they found the most commonly injured body parts were shoulder, low back, and knee. Anyone who powerlifts, this shouldn't be much of a surprise to you. Injury occurrence was 1 per 1,000 hours of training. As you'll see, this is a very low incidency of injury. Again, due to the controlled and slow manner of the lifts, you'd probably expect that. Although with deadlifting there, some people might find that somewhat surprising since it has a bad reputation for lower back injury. Undeservedly or correctly so, it does. As you can see, there's a low injury rate compared to other sports, an extremely low injury rate when compared to sports like basketball or football, non-contact sports that have injury rates of 6 to 7 per 1,000 hours training. The daily workout of a large proportion of lifters is affected by disorders that don't need to interrupt training. So that could be things like a lower back strain that can be dealt with, or a glute, it's like tendinopathies, or things that can be managed. Overuse injuries in effect. So that's the profile of powerlifting. Probably nothing in there that you wouldn't expect. Certainly no acute injury. It's not a very dynamic sport, so you wouldn't really expect acute injury, although it does happen, as Brandon Lilly will tell you. Again, hope your rehab's going well, Brandon, if you're watching this, which I doubt you are. Okay, so injuries in weightlifting. Most common injuries tend to be knee, low back, and shoulder. So again, the same areas as in the other lifting sport, powerlifting. Most common injury cause was chronic overuse. I think it was 67% global. So there was an acute injury profile in this sport, although much lesser than other sports. For the knee, 85% of problems were inflammation and tendonitis, as to be expected from a sport where you squat in pretty much 90% of your training. Lower back was 75%, and that was strains. So again, overuse, small tissue damage, nothing to be nothing that wouldn't be expected. And shoulder, 55% of those injuries were strains. So that does leave 45% to acute and other causes, which again in weightlifting, due to the dynamic nature of the lifts and the shoulder joint, that's probably where you would expect, without looking at any data, most of the injury profile to happen. There was catching a snatch and having too much rotation on it, not getting away from it, snatching with straps on. This is all from training injuries as well. This isn't from competition. Injury rate was 3.3 per 1,000 hours of training. So relative to other sports, we're still talking of a fairly low chance of injury. The authors said it was a similar chance of injury to other sports, although when we go on to look at the next sport, you'll see that's a fairly low incidency of injury. And just to go over the studies just quickly, it was in elite competitive weightlifters, and it was from a sample of lifters from the United States Olympic Training Center. It doesn't state the number of lifters on the program. So if you want to look at any of these studies, the links at the bottom of the video. So next up, strongman. So injury rates of strongman. Most commonly injured areas, again, lower back, shoulder, bicep, and knee. We can see the lower back, shoulder, and knee are the common areas in all three lifting sports, as you'll probably could have guessed without watching the video. Although bicep and strongman, due to the nature of the awkwardness of the implements, tires, stones, logs, axles, there's a lot of pull and motion. There's a lot of awkward implements. Nothing is neat in strongman really. So as you'll see, looking at the rate of injury, it was 6.8 per 1,000 hours of training. So that's 6.8 times more likely to get an injury in strongman than you are opposed to powerlifting, and twice as likely to get an injury in strongman as you are to getting one from weightlifting, which I'm sure anyone who's competed in the sport or trained for the sport will be able to tell you it's extremely hard on the body. Also within that training, they did a survey of, I think it was around, I'll just pull up a study here. They looked at the training of 213 athletes, all done from an online questionnaire. And they looked at training, events training, and competition. They found that they called it traditional training, so like squatting, deadlifting with a barbell, pressing with a barbell. They found that athletes were 1.8 times more likely to sustain an injury during events training, so that's tires, stones, the implements you'd use in a competition. Typically, most strongmen will have an events day where they train during the week with barbells. They maybe do some log or some axle. They typically have an events day at the weekend or somewhere in the week where they practice with implements, farmers walks, all of that. And due to this, and according to this study, I think, which is the first of its kind, you're 1.8 more times more likely to sustain an injury when training with those implements due to their awkward nature, the more dynamic nature of the events, like walking, running, change of direction, and loading. It's probably to be expected that that's the case. The one thing that is of extreme interest to me, I don't know about anyone else, is 68% of the injuries were acute and of a moderate severity. So when we're looking at the profile of weightlifting, you see in the knee that 85% of things were overuse. So that's putting load on a structure over and over again till eventually it inflames, and then in the long run it breaks. So the fact that things are acute, so we're talking torn biceps, torn calves, we're talking torn ligaments, torn tendons, broken bones, sort of thing that you probably would expect to see in a contact sport like rugby, or a change of direction sport like rolled ankles, ACLs, MCLs, but tendon ruptures, the sort of things you'd expect to see in a more dynamic sport, which strongman is relative to the other two, is what you see. And the authors do make do caution the increased risk of injury of training with the implements. So they make a point in their study to mention that, so it might be worth taking note of. Okay, so that's the injury profiles of the three sports. We probably should have started off the talk with, which we'll just do now, is is an acute injury. An acute injury is something that happens, so like a broken bone, if you, like someone, your leg is trapped and someone runs into your leg and they break your femur in two. That's an acute injury. An overuse injury is something like RSI, repetitive strain injury, or tennis elbow, where you repeat a task over and over and over again. Load a structure, so load a bicep, doing bicep curls all of the time, not allowing for enough time for tissue recovery and remodeling. You get micro damage, builds up in the tissue, so small tears in the muscle fibers, small bits of damage in tendons and ligaments that don't get a chance to repair, and over time it starts becoming symptomatic, starts becoming painful, becomes inflamed. You get non-acute pain from it, you get chronic pain from it, and if this sort of process keeps going and going and going, eventually the tissue will break. So you get something like a stress fracture in a bone, where it's been damaged over and over again, hasn't had a chance to repair, and then eventually it breaks. And it tends to be where you get like an acute fracture, it'll be a clean break, and it'll be a shorter process because it only has to fuse such a way. Stress fractures can be things like spiral fractures. They can be things like compound fractures that take a long time to heal, and the recovery from a overuse injury, if it's bone anyway, can be much longer than a recovery from an acute or clean break. Things like tendons and muscles have a slightly different recovery profile due to the nature of the tissue. Hopefully I haven't talked too much bullshit. So we'll move on to the next slide. Strategy 1, prevention. As you always hear, prevention is better than a cure. So what we try to do, and in professional sport or in elite sport, athletes have everything laid out for them on a plate. They will go through this process. So they'll have a physiotherapist, strength and conditioning coach. In a professional setting, you'll have a doctor. You'll have various professionals that will set up this process for the athlete, so the athlete doesn't have to think about it. However, as everyone will know watching this video, who's a novice lifter or an amateur athlete, this isn't made available to everybody. You can maybe make these things available to you if you're affluent. You can afford to hire a physiotherapist to do screening. You can afford to hire a coach to help you with your training. But this, for most people, isn't the case. It's not feasible. So what I'm going to do for our prevention is going to walk through the kind of model that we would do for a professional or elite athlete, and how you can maybe do your own version of this. So we start off with, so you do a screening for injury risk. So this is very common in elite sport. Basically, there'll be a battery of tests that the physiotherapist will do. They'll do like a hip flexor flexibility test, a thoracic mobility test, a whole battery of tests and a screen where we can say your ankle range is less on 1 foot. This could be an injury risk for these reasons. Here are some prevention strategies to increase the range of motion of your ankle. This is somewhere where it might be worthwhile including a physiotherapist. If you can find a good sports physiotherapist that offers their services up privately, you could get them to do a battery of tests or a screening process on you, and maybe help you out with some prevention strategies. You could have come out with this. So maybe you've got a weak glute med, or you have poor motor control in one leg, which if you play a sport where there's a lot of change of direction is an injury risk. They can maybe help you out with some prevention strategies that you can enact. So the first of all is the screening process is the most important, because it will let you see if there's anything that will predispose you to injury, and you can do something about it. So secondly, flexibility and mobility work. This is very general in nature, but for lifting, target areas are very much ankle, structures around the hip, so hamstrings, hip flexors, adductors, lower back and glutes are all areas in any kind of squatting sport, so weightlifting especially, powerlifting next, and then strongman, you really need to pay attention to. Also in the shoulder, thoracic mobility, shoulder mobility, stretching the chest, stretching the back, making sure you're supple in the kind of shoulder and hip regions, can give you extra range of motion, which will allow you to achieve better positions when you're lifting, and also